5. The Four Werts and the Expulsion of Marx. We have no very detailed record of Marx's personal life during his exile in Paris. His wife presented him with their first child, a daughter, and then returned proudly to Germany to show it to their relatives. Marx remained on the best of terms with his friends in Cologne, and their gift of 1,000 thaler helped considerably towards making the year in Paris such a fruitful one. He was in close touch with Heinrich Heine, and he did much to make the year 1844 a memorable one in the life of the poet, assisting at the birth of the Winter Fables, the Song of the Weavers, and the immortal satires on the German despots. They were not long together, but Marx remained loyal to Heine even when the howling of the Philistines against him became still more furious than it had been against Herwer. And he generously remained silent when the bedridden Heine cited him untruthfully as a witness that the annual grant the poet received from the Guizot ministry was irreproachable. As we know, in his youth Marx himself had vainly yearned for poetic laurels, and all his life he retained a lively sympathy for poets, invariably showing great toleration towards their little weaknesses. He felt that poets were peculiar people who should be permitted to go their own way and must not be measured with the standards of ordinary or even extraordinary mortals. If they were to sing they must be battered. It was no use belaboring them with severe criticism. But he regarded Heine as something more than a poet, as a Titer also, and in the dispute between Boerner and Heine, which served at the time as a sort of dividing line between the sheep and the goats, he steadfastly supported Heine, declaring that the doltish treatment accorded to Heine's work on Boerner by the Christian Germanicophs was unique in any period of German literature, which had never at any time lacked its full complement of dolts. He was never misled by the shout about Heine's alleged treachery, which even affected Engels and Lassalle, though both had the excuse of extreme youth. "We need very few signs to understand each other," wrote Heine on one occasion to excuse his confused scribble, and the sentence had a deeper significance than the immediate one which prompted it. Marx was still a student when Heine, in 1834, declared, "The spirit of freedom breathed by our classical literature is less active amongst our scholars, poets and literary men than amongst the great mass of our artisans and workers." And 10 years later, when Marx was living in Paris, Heine declared, "In their struggle against the existing state of affairs the proletarians can claim the most progressive minds, the greatest philosophers, as their leaders." The freedom and accuracy of this judgment become still clearer when one realizes that at the same time Heine was pouring scorn on the pothouse politics of the little conventicles of exiles, in which Boerner played the role of giant killer. Heine realized that there was a great difference between Marx occupying himself with a meager handful of artisans and Boerner doing so. Heine and Marx were bound together by the spirit of German philosophy and French socialism, and by a common and deep-rooted dislike for that Christian Germanic sloth, that false Teutonism, which sought to modernize the ancient garb of German folly with radical phrases. The Massmanns and Venedies who live in Heine's satires trudged along in Boerner's footsteps. Though Boerner may have been far above them in intellect and wit, Boerner had no feeling either for art or philosophy, as was revealed by his declaration that Goethe was a rhymed and Hegel an unrhymed knave. And when he broke with the great traditions of German history, he established no new intellectual relation to the new powers of Western European culture. Heine, on the other hand, could not abandon Goethe and Hegel without abandoning himself, and he therefore plunged with fierce avidity into French socialism as a new source of intellectual life. His works live on and arouse the anger of the grandchildren as they aroused the anger of their grandfathers, whilst the writings of Boerner are forgotten, less on account of their jog-trot style than on account of their content, referring to the backbiting gossip which Boerner had set going against Heine even whilst the two were standing shoulder to shoulder, and which Boerner's literary legatees were unwise enough to publish later on. Marx declared that he had never imagined the man to be so absurd, superficial and petty. However, he would never have called the personal honesty of the gossiper into question on that account had he actually carried out his intention of writing about the dispute. It is always difficult to find worse Jesuits in public life than those narrow-minded and orthodox radicals who wrap themselves up in the threadbare cloak of their own virtue and stop at nothing in their insinuations against the finer and freer spirits to whom it is given to recognize the deeper relations of history. Marx was always on the side of the latter and never with the former, particularly as he had made the acquaintance of the virtuous ones himself. In later years Marx spoke of Russian aristocrats who had shown him the greatest solicitude during his Paris exile, adding that this should not be rated too highly. The Russian aristocrats were educated at German universities and spent their youth in Paris. They invariably snatched at all the extremes the West offered, but this did not prevent them becoming thorough blackguards immediately they entered the service of the state. Marx appears to have been referring to a certain Count Tolstoy, a secret agent of the Russian government, or to others of a like kidney. He was certainly not referring to that Russian aristocrat on whose intellectual development he exercised a great influence in those days, namely, Michael Bakunin. Even after the paths of the two men had widely separated, Bakunin bore witness to this influence. And in the dispute between Marx and Rouhet he took Marx's side, although up to then Rouhet had been his protector. This dispute flared up again in the summer of 1844, and this time publicly. A paper entitled The Four Vets had been appearing twice a week in Paris since the first day of 1844. Its origin was by no means irreproachable. It was founded by a certain Heinrich Bornstein, who ran a theatrical and general publicity business and sought to further his interests thereby. The necessary funds had been provided by Meyerbeer, who lived preferably in Paris. We know from Heine that this Royal Prussian conductor was very keen on obtaining the greatest possible amount of publicity, and he probably needed it. As a cunning businessman, Bornstein gave his paper a patriotic cloak and appointed Adalbert von Bornstedt, a former Prussian officer and a thoroughly venal character who was the confidant of Metternich and at the same time in the pay of the Berlin government, as its editor. When the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher appeared, it was greeted with a salve of abuse by the Four Vets. And it would be difficult to say whether the abuse was characterized more by its foolishness than by its vulgarity. However, the affairs of the paper did not prosper. Bornstein had organized a regular translation factory in order to sell the latest pieces played in Paris with the greatest possible speed to German stage managers. And he sought to cut out the young German dramatists and win the German Philistines, who were becoming restive, by mouthing a few phrases about moderate progress and condemning altruism both on the left and on the right. His editor, Bornstedt, was in the same boat because he had to lull the suspicions of the emigrants if he was to associate with them freely, a proceeding which was absolutely necessary if he was to earn his blood money. However, the Prussian government was blind even to its own interest of self-preservation, and it prohibited the sale of the Four Vets in its territory, an example which was followed by other German governments. Bornstedt threw in his hand at the beginning of May, regarding the game as hopeless, but not so Bornstein, who wanted to do business and was not at all particular about the way in which he did it. With the cold-blooded calculation of a cunning speculator, he said to himself that if the Four Vets was to be prohibited in Prussia in any case, it might just as well seek for itself all the advantages of a prohibited paper, so that the German Philistines would consider it worthwhile to obtain such a paper secretly. It suited his book extremely well, therefore, when the youthful firebrand Bernays offered him a fiery article for the Four Vets, and after a certain amount of preliminary skirmishing Bernays was made editor in place of Bornstedt. Owing to the lack of any other medium, the German exiles in Paris now began to contribute to the Four Vets, each on his own responsibility and independent of the editorial board. One of the first to do so was Rouhet, who came forward under his own name and even defended Marx's contributions to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher as though he were in agreement with them. A few months later, however, he published 2 anonymous articles in the Four Vets, a few short observations concerning Prussian policy and a long article containing nothing but gossip about the Prussian dynasty, interlarded with remarks about the drinking king and the limping queen and their purely spiritual marriage, etc. The articles were signed a Prussian, and under the circumstances it appeared as though Marx was the author, for Rouhet was a member of the Dresden Town Council and registered at the Saxon Embassy in Paris. Bernays was a Bavarian from Rhineland-Westphalia, whilst Bornstein was a Hamburger. And although he had lived for a long time in Austria, he had never lived for any length of time in Prussia. It is impossible to discover now what Rouhet had in mind when he adopted such a misleading pen name, but, as his letters to his friends and relations show, he had worked himself up into a furious rage against Marx, to whom he referred as a thoroughly vile fellow and an insolent Jew. And it is undeniable that 2 years later, in a penitent petition to the Prussian Minister of the Interior, he betrayed the comrades of his exile in Paris, and against his better knowledge loaded on the shoulders of these nameless young men the sins he had himself committed in the Four Vets. It is of course quite possible that he signed his articles a Prussian in order to give them greater weight as they dealt with Prussian affairs. But if this were the case, he acted with irresponsible thoughtlessness, and it is quite understandable that Marx hastened to parry the trick of the alleged Prussian. Marx's answer was couched in a dignified tone. He dealt solely with the 1 or 2 so to speak, objective observations which Rouhet had made on Prussian policy and dismissed the whole gossip about the Prussian dynasty in a short footnote. Special reasons cause me to point out that the above contribution is the first I have made to the four vets. As a matter of fact, it was also the last. The point at issue was the revolt of the Silesian weavers in 1844, which Rouhet treated as an unimportant affair, declaring that it had no political core and that without such a core no social revolution was possible. The essence of Marx's reply had already been dealt with in his treatise on the Jewish question. Political force cannot heal social evils because the state cannot abolish the conditions whose product it is. He sharply attacked utopianism, declaring that socialism was not possible without a revolution, but he attacked Blanqui and his followers just as sharply, declaring that political sagacity was deceiving the social instinct when it sought to make progress by means of small, useless putches. He defined the character of the revolution with epigrammatic trenchantcy: every revolution dissolves the old society and insofar it is social, every revolution overthrows the old power and insofar it is political. A social revolution with a political core, as demanded by Rouhet, was senseless, but a political revolution with a social core was reasonable. The revolution in general, the overthrow of the existing power and the dissolution of the old relations, was a political act. Insofar as socialism first had need of destruction and dissolution, it needed this political act, but when its organizational activity began, when its innate aim, its core, appeared, socialism flung off the political cloak. These ideas were developed from Marx's own treatise on the Jewish question, and the revolt of the Silesian weavers quickly confirmed what he had written about the feebleness of the class struggle in Germany. His friend Jung wrote from Cologne that there was now more communism to be found in the columns of the Kölnische Zeitung than formerly in the columns of the Rheinische Zeitung, and that the former had opened up a subscription list for the families of the fallen and imprisoned weavers. At a farewell dinner party for the retiring district governor 100 thaler had been collected for the list amongst the highest officials and richest merchants of Cologne. And sympathy was being shown everywhere for the dangerous rebels. What a few months ago would have been a daring and completely new attitude for them, has now become a matter of course. Marx made use of the general sympathy shown towards the weavers against Rouhet's underestimation of their revolt. But he was not deceived for one moment by the lack of resistance shown by the bourgeoisie towards new social tendencies and ideas. He realized that immediately the working class movement gained any real power, the effect would be to stifle the political antipathies and antagonisms within the camp of the ruling classes and to cause the latter to direct their whole hostility against the workers. He showed the deep difference between bourgeois and proletarian emancipation when he pointed out that the one sprang from social well-being and the other from social misery. The bourgeois revolution was caused by the isolation from the political commonwealth and the state, whilst the proletarian revolution was caused by the isolation from humanity and the real commonwealth of humanity. The isolation from the latter was incomparably more thorough, more intolerable, more terrible and more innately contradictory than isolation from the political commonwealth. And therefore the liquidation of this isolation, even as a partial phenomenon represented by the revolt of the Silesian weavers, meant incalculably more. Just as the human being was more than the citizen, and human life more than political life, Marx's views on the revolt of the Silesian weavers were thus fundamentally different from those of Rouhet. Consider only the Song of the Weavers, the striking, trenchant, ruthless and powerful way in which the proletariat hurls the battle cry of its antagonism against the society of private property. The Silesian revolt began where the French and English insurrections ended, with the consciousness of the proletariat as a class. The whole action was of this character. Not only did it destroy machinery, the rival of the workers, but also the merchants' records, their property titles. In the beginning at least, all other movements were directed exclusively against the industrialists, against the visible enemy, but this movement was also directed against the banker, the invisible enemy. And finally, no English insurrection was carried out with the same courage, deliberation and persistence. In this connection Marx also refers to the brilliant writings of Weitling, who often excelled Proudhon in theory although he remained behind him in practice. Can the bourgeoisie, its philosophers and scribes included, show us a work on its own emancipation, political emancipation, comparable to Weitling's guarantees of harmony and liberty? When one compares the sober and subdued mediocrity of German political literature with this incomparably brilliant debut of the German worker, and when one compares the undersized and down-at-heel political shoes of the German bourgeoisie with the giant boots of the youthful proletariat, One is entitled to prophesy the frame of an athlete for this neglected son of Germany. Marx declared that the German proletariat was the theoretician amongst the European proletariats, as the English proletariat was their economist and the French proletariat their politician. Marx's verdict on Weitling's writings has been confirmed by the judgment of posterity. For their time they were brilliant achievements, and their brilliance was enhanced by the fact that the German journeyman tailor prepared the way for an understanding between the working class movement and socialism before Louis Blanc, Cabet and Proudhon, and more effectively. However, Marx's historical estimation of the revolt of the Silesian weavers seems extraordinary to us today. He read tendencies into it which were certainly not present, and Rouhet seems to have estimated the revolt more correctly when he declared it to be no more than a hunger revolt without any deeper significance. However, as was the case with regard to their earlier dispute about Ower, so here we see again that to be formally in the right is the failing of the Philistine against genius, and that in the last resort a great heart always triumphs over a narrow mind. The meagre handful of artisans referred to disdainfully by Rouhet, but zealously studied by Marx, were organized in the League of the Just which had developed in the 30s from the French secret societies and out of their final defeat in 1839. This defeat had been a good thing for the organization because its dispersed elements reassembled not only in their old center, Paris, but also in England and Switzerland, where the freedom of meeting and association offered them more room for development, so that these slips from the old trunk began to develop more powerfully than the mother tree. The Paris organization was led by Hermann Ueberbeck of Danzig, who was entangled in Cabet's moralizing utopianism and had translated Cabet's Utopia into German. Weitling, who led the agitation in Switzerland, proved himself the intellectual superior of Ueberbeck, whilst the London leaders of the League, the watchmaker Joseph Moll, the shoemaker Heinrich Bauer, and Karl Schapper, a former student of forestry who earned his living sometimes as a compositor and sometimes as a teacher of languages, also proved themselves superior to Ueberbeck, at least in revolutionary determination. Marx probably first heard about these three real men from Engels who, when he visited Marx in September, 1844, while passing through Paris, spoke of the deep impression they had made on him. During the 10 days Engels stayed in Paris, much of his time was spent in the company of Marx, and they had an opportunity of confirming the far-reaching agreement in their ideas which had already revealed itself in their contributions to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch. In the meantime, their old friend Bruno Bauer had turned against these ideas and published a criticism in a literary publication he had founded. The two learned of this attack whilst they were together and immediately decided to answer it. Engels sat down at once and put all he had to say about the matter on paper. But in accordance with his character, Marx went much more deeply into the matter than they had originally planned, and in several months of hard work he produced a work of over 300 pages. With the conclusion of this work in January 1845 his stay in Paris also came to an end. After taking over the editorship of the Vorwärts, Bernays had energetically continued his attacks on the Christian Germanic simpletons in Berlin, and there was no lack of lèse-majesté in the paper. Whilst Heine shot one barbed arrow after the other against the new Alexander in the Palace of Berlin, it was not long before the legitimate monarchy in Germany petitioned the non-legitimate bourgeois monarchy in France for the use of the police cudgel against the Vorwärts. But Guizot proved hard of hearing. Despite his reactionary opinions, he was a man of some culture, and in addition he had no desire to play the myrmidon to Prussian despotism and thus caught the scorn and contempt of the opposition at home. But he became more complaisant when the Vorwärts published a nefarious article on the attempt made by Mehring on the life of Frederick William IV. After a discussion in the cabinet, Guizot agreed to take action against the Vorwärts on 2 counts. The prosecution of the responsible editor for not having deposited a sufficient bond with the authorities, and his indictment on a charge of incitement to regicide. The Berlin government agreed to the first proposal, but when it was carried into execution it proved ineffective. Bernays was sentenced to 2 months' imprisonment and fined £2 for his failure to comply with the deposit provisions. But the Vorwärts immediately announced that in the future it would appear as a monthly, and in this way it completely circumvented the deposit law. The Berlin government would not hear of the second proposal, in all probability in the well-founded fear that the jurymen of Paris would show little inclination to strain their consciences on behalf of the King of Prussia. But it continued to lodge complaints, and finally it demanded the expulsion of the editors and contributors of the paper from France. After long negotiations, Guizot agreed. It was assumed at the time, and Engels repeated the charge in his speech at the grave of Frau Marx, that Guizot was won over by the inglorious mediation of Alexander von Humboldt, who was related by marriage to the Prussian Minister for Foreign Affairs. Lately attempts have been made to clear Humboldt's memory of this charge on the ground that the Prussian archives contain no reference to any such mediation. That, however, is hardly enough because, first of all, the archives are known to be incomplete and, secondly, it is not usual for such matters to be committed to writing. All that the archives prove is that one of the decisive acts in the affair took place behind the scenes. The Berlin government had been irritated chiefly by Heine, who had published in the Vorwärts 11 of his sharpest satires on the situation in Prussia and in particular on the king, but for Guizot, Heine represented the most ticklish point in the whole disagreeable business. He was a poet with a European reputation, and the French people regarded him almost as a national poet. Naturally, Guizot could not explain these difficulties direct to Berlin, and therefore a little bird seems to have made some mention of the matter to the Prussian ambassador in Paris. For on the 4th of October he suddenly reported to Berlin that it was very doubtful whether Heine, who had published only 2 of his poems in the Vorwärts, was a member of the editorial staff of the paper, and at last the authorities in Berlin understood. Heine himself was therefore not molested, but on January 11, 1845, a number of other German fugitives who had contributed to the Vorwärts or who were suspected of having done so, received orders of expulsion, including Marx, Rouhet, Bakunin, Bornstein, and Bernays. Some of them saved themselves, Bornstein by giving an undertaking to cease publishing the Vorwärts, and Rouhet by running from the Saxon ambassador to various French deputies and back again in order to assure everyone what a loyal citizen he really was. Naturally, Marx was not open for anything of that sort, and he therefore prepared to move to Brussels. His exile in Paris had lasted a little over a year, but it was perhaps the most important one in all his years of wandering and apprenticeship. It was rich in experience and stimulation, and it was made still richer by the winning of a comrade in arms who served him magnificently and to the very end.